Hi everyone, it's Kathy for Not Too Shabby. I am excited to share this quick and easy Halloween card using the Happy Halloween set from Not Too Shabby. I started out by stamping the little witch and the little candy corn wearing a witch's hat onto a piece of Cougar Super Smooth cardstock. I used Memento Tuxedo black ink to stamp the images, and then I just jump right into the coloring. For the green hair, I started out with G29, and I used these colors very sparingly the first go round. I barely added any of the G29, and the flick motions that I did were from right underneath the brim of the hat, and from the very bottom of her hair I did an upward flicking motion, but I didn't go all the way up to meet the downward flicking motions from underneath the hat. After I was done with the G29, I added a little bit of YG17, and I am leaving quite a bit of white space so that I can fill it in with my lighter colors. After the YG17, I added some YG03, and then I blended it with YG01. I moved on to color her face and her arms. I started with E21, then I added in E53, and then I blended those first two colors out with E51. On a side note, I did leave all of the coloring in for this video, and I do have it sped up, but not too much. I struggle with green markers sometimes, especially when I bring in the darker greens like the G29, and I absolutely struggle with purple markers. So, why not make this one really challenging and bring in the colors that I struggle with the most? But the reason that I chose those colors was to share with you my struggles that I have with certain color combinations and how I keep going and keep working with the image until I get the saturation or the highlights or the shadows that I am looking for. And I have mentioned before that with Cougar Super Smooth cardstock, sometimes you have to let the markers dry before you start adding in the darker color again or trying to blend more. For me personally, I found that by letting the colors settle in and coming back to it and adding a second layer of color, I get better results because the paper is dry, so the markers aren't just automatically blending within the fibers of the markers. Nope, within the fibers of the paper. Moving right along, for her hat and her dress, I started out with V17. And at first, V17 was going to be my darkest color, but you'll see in a minute here that I end up coming in with an even darker color. I was not getting the contrast that I was hoping for. But with the V17, I started out with that color and I added it underneath the brim that is closest to her head. And on the left-hand side, I added more of the V17 because there's a smaller area of underneath the brim of the hat. I added a little bit of the V17 along the top of the hat underneath the sash, and then I added some above the sash and off to the right-hand side a little bit. For her dress, I just did little lines down the side, but I didn't go all the way up to the stamped line. I did leave a very small amount of white space just so the sleeves of her dress just didn't kind of meld into the body of the dress. The next color I came in with is B11, and I blended out the V17, and you'll see on the very top of her hat how I left just a tiny little bit of a white space up there, as well as on the rim of the hat, the front part of the rim of the hat, I left a white line, and underneath the brim of the hat, I added in the BV11 a little bit on the right, and I filled in the rest of the area on the left. On her dress, I did go in with the BV11 and add a little bit, but I made sure to leave more white space in the center of her dress, just so I could have a nice center highlight there. To finish up the hat and the dress, I used BV00, and I did blend over all of the other colors that I had previously colored in. I'll be sure to have all of the marker colors that I used as well as the other supplies that I used listed in the description box below. And on a side note, this stamp set was actually the very first Not Too Shabby branded stamp set that I purchased, which was for last Halloween, and I have 3 other videos using this set. I'll make sure to link to 2 of them at the end of this video, and I actually have yet another video using this set. And the last time I checked, Jamie did still have this stamp set in stock. Anyway, let's get back to the coloring. Next, I came back in with the G29 to add more of the flicks of color to her hair, to really add in some shadows and more highlights and lowlights, I guess, on her hair. I did come back in again with the YG17 and added a few more flicks, mostly to soften some of the darker areas that are right underneath the rim of her hat, because I did very tiny little flick marks and I wanted to have those blended out a little bit better. And then I finished it up with another layer of the YG03. For her face and her arms, I did come back in with the E51 and did a quick swipe over her face and her arms again, just to blend out her skin a little bit more. This is about where I decide that I don't really have a whole lot of contrast on her hat or her dress. So I came in with BV17 and added that in where I had originally added in the V17. So underneath the rim of the hat, and then underneath the sash, and then a little bit above the sash. I did the same thing on her dress. I added it down the sides of the dress, but I did leave space between the stamped line and the sleeve so that they, again, didn't just meld together. And then I came in with the BV11 and blended out the BV17, both on her hat and her dress. And I thought that the BV00 was a little bit too light, so I decided to come in and darken that up just a tiny little bit with BV01. And even though I went darker than the BV00, which I barely went darker because I went to a 01, it did mellow out those highlights, but I didn't totally lose the highlights. That is something that I'll do quite often. If I think a highlight is too bright, I'll just go up a shade darker and go over the really bright spots. The trick again is you want to make sure that the ink is totally dry before you try to do that. Otherwise, you could totally lose the highlight. And also, if the ink is still wet, the markers will just keep blending within the fibers of the paper. For the sash that is on the hat, I started with C7 and I added just a tiny little bit of that color on the very outer edge of the sash on her hat, and then I did it on either side of the buckle and then also on the inside of the buckle, because the buckle would cast a little bit of a shadow on the sash, both on the outside of the buckle and the inside of the buckle. I used C7 on every other stripe of her stockings as well as along the bottom of her shoes. Then I came in with C5 to blend out the C7. And again, I'm leaving quite a bit of white space on the sash and in the center where the buckle is to make sure that I have a good highlight on that. For her stockings, I blended out the C7 with the C5, and then I filled in more of her shoe with the C5 and leaving some white space at the top of her shoes. I finished up with C3 on the sash for her hat, as well as the top of her shoes. Then I decided that the sash on the hat didn't have enough contrast, so I did actually come in with my black marker. And I would say that my black marker is probably the one that I use the least often, mostly because it's so dark, and if you make a mistake, it is really hard to cover it up. So if I use it, it's usually in an instance like this where I just want to make certain sections really dark, like on the sash of her hat. And I did blend that out with C7, and then I came in with C5 to blend out the C7. For the rest of the stripes on her stockings, I just added a little bit of C1 to those, just so that they weren't so stark white against the darker stripes. Then I used R30 to add a little bit of blush to her cheeks, and Y08 to color in the buckle on the sash on her hat. For her shoes, I came back in with the C5 to blend out some of the harsher lines. The highlight again was just too stark, so I added a little bit more of the C5 and then blended that out again with the C3. Then for her belt, I held off on coloring that in until the very last because I had no idea what color I was going to color it in. I didn't want to do black because I thought it would kind of get lost around her purple dress, and the patterned paper that I used had a piece of candy corn that was purple, pink, and white. So I brought in V05, and I didn't think that that was bright enough, so I just went right over that with RV09. Moving on to the candy corn, I started out with Y38 and added that to the very outer edges. And then I came in with Y08 and blended that towards the center some more and left a little white highlight right in the center, and then I blended all of those together with Y06. For the orange part of the candy corn, I started with YR18 and added that on the very outer edges. Then I came in with YR07 and blended out more towards the center, and I made sure to leave quite a bit of white space for a center highlight. And then I blended all of that together with the YR04. And with the YR04, I did go over the YR18 as well as the YR07 just to make sure that I got some pretty clean blending lines there. For the white part of the candy corn, I started with C5 and I used that very, very sparingly underneath the brim of the hat as well as on the outer edges of the candy corn. I added in a tiny little bit of C3. Then I came in with C1 and went over the C3 and C5 to start getting those two colors to blend. And then I did a quick swipe with my colorless blender to get rid of the really harsh lines. Now, with coloring in areas on an object that are white, there still would be shadows, which is why I chose the cool gray markers. So there would be a shadow on the top of this candy corn because this little candy corn is actually wearing a hat. And the thing that I have found for me is when I color in with the gray markers, when I first do it, it always looks so gray that it doesn't look white at all by the time I'm done. The trick is to stop looking at it, because when you're looking at something that you're working on, that's the only thing that you're looking at. That's the only thing that you're really focusing on. So for me, what I have to do is I have to color in the grays like I normally would, do a quick swipe with my colorless blender, then I stop looking at it, literally, because I'm very tempted to go back and work on those the grays to lighten them up. And what ends up happening is they end up getting darker. So that's, I guess, my little tip for you when coloring white areas on an object with gray markers. Anyway, moving along and coloring the hat on the little candy corn, I do have this sped up just a little bit more because I colored it the same way that I did for the hat that the witch is wearing. I just used different colors. I decided to use the same green markers that I did for the witch's hair to color in the hat on the candy corn. I started out with the G29 and I did the same technique on this hat as I did her hat. So with the G29, I added that very sparingly underneath the sash on the hat and then underneath the rim, again closest to the candy corn's face, and then again above the sash on the hat. And then I came in with YG17 to blend out the G29, again making sure to leave a nice white highlight on the top of the brim of the hat. After the YG17, I came in with YG03 and blended that out. I made sure to leave white space for a highlight, and then I used YG01 to fill in that white space to maintain the highlights. For the sash on the hat, I started with BV17 because I figured that would be a dark enough color to get the contrast that I'm looking for, which was what I learned when I colored in the purple hat on the witch. And then I came in and colored in the rest of the sash with the BV11. And as on the purple hat, I thought that the highlight was a little bit too bright on the green hat, so I did come in with the YG03 and went over the areas that I had used the YG01. I used Y08 to color in the buckle on the candy corn, and that finishes up the coloring. I did run those images through my brother's Scan-A-Cut machine to cut them out, and I started to put my card together and forgot to turn on the camera. So I cut a piece of patterned paper down to 3 3/4 by 5 1/2 and adhered that to the front of a top folding A2 sized purple note card. I die cut a circle from white cardstock and another circle from purple cardstock. I did put foam tape on the back of the witch and the candy corn and adhered those in place. I stamped my sentiment onto a piece of white cardstock and then adhered that to a piece of purple cardstock, and of course had to add foam tape to that and adhered that to the front of my card. And that finishes up my card for today. Thank you so much for joining me. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you've not yet subscribed, I'd love it if you would. And don't forget to ring the bell so you're notified every time a new video is posted. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.